detail. I'm going to start recording here. I want to talk a little bit more in detail about these documents that we looked at, that we started to look at last week. There are three different documents from three different perspectives, but I think they paint a very unique picture about what's going on in the colonies right now. Before I forget, in person today, we watched a CNN 10, and it was about before I forget, because this was something I wanted to mention to you, and we'll have more time to talk about it this week. As you probably have heard, there's a vacancy on the Supreme Court after Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing. And there is a really big situation right now because there's kind of like a debate on whether or not that vacancy should be filled this close to the election, because the last time there was a vacancy was in 2016, which was an election year, and that nomination was denied. That was a nomination made by the previous president, Barack Obama. Okay, so it'll be interesting to see what happens. I'm not trying to get into the politics of it that much because that's not really my place. I will tell you that Supreme Court justice nominations are a very unique position because Supreme Court justices serve for life. They don't have to worry about re-election. They're not involved in the re-election process because it was kind of intended that Supreme Court justices are not bound by a connection to a political party, but rather how they interpret the Constitution. And so Supreme Court justices actually serve for life until they resign, or I should say retire, until they pass away. Or if there is a third option, if they are considered to be doing something illegal, they can be impeached. But for the most part, they're going to serve in that position for life. And it's a very big decision because the president's going to make a nomination and then it goes to the Senate, which is part of the legislative branch, to approve the nomination or deny the nomination. So it'll be interesting to see what's going to happen in the next couple days already into the next couple of weeks, because we're 40 days, 43 days or something like that from the election. And there's a lot at stake for both parties, obviously. So something to keep an eye on, and we'll talk more about it as we go along. So, okay, let's talk about this document that pertains to the assignment. Okay, so let's kind of recap a few things of what we talked about. The date, we're into 1765, so we're 2 years after the end of the French and Indian War, and we know that the country, Britain's dealing with three major issues following the war. The issue with all this new land they have and keeping settlers out of that land to avoid conflict with natives. The fact that they're trying to discourage smuggling in the colonies and getting the colonists to do business with Britain itself and not be buying goods from other countries at cheaper prices. And lastly, probably the biggest one is the debt that they accumulated from the French and Indian War. It's a tremendous amount of money, and to be able to have any kind of really normalcy and to function as a country, they're going to have to raise revenue. And the way they're going to do that is through taxes. And you're going to begin to see them, Britain start to levy taxes or apply taxes on the colonists. And so the one thing I need you to understand, no matter which law we talk about, no matter which tax we're talking about here, when we are focusing on a situation involving Britain, it's going to be that it's not the actual tax or what is being taxed. It's going to be the method in which the tax is introduced. Okay. And so what you need to understand is that the relationship between king and subject, or the monarchy and its people, is a very unique one, and it goes back hundreds of years, and it dates back to a document called the Magna Carta, which is really the very first document that was created to give any specific individual rights laid out on paper to subjects in a kingdom. So if you were living within the realm of a monarchy, you still had certain rights, okay? And so that's something to keep in mind as we look at these three documents. And so going back to document A, we see, this is printed in a Boston newspaper. So this Boston, remember, is kind of like the central hub of rebellion, and it will be time and time again during this period of the American Revolution. Okay. The author has wished to remain anonymous, as you can see, just printed with the letters BW. It's probably to avoid some kind of punishment, perhaps within the government, something could happen within the colony, but it's most likely, because they could probably face some kind of backlash from loyalists. There's far more loyalists in the colonies in 1765 than there are people who are trying to challenge the authority of the king or who have been opposed to these laws. It's much more still based on more people are loyal to the king than not. So that could be part of the reason as well. But if you look in here, it's really, it's really a situation where it focuses on this singular quoted statement. Okay. When it says it is a standard maxim of English liberty, and you can see the maximum statement expressing a general truth of English liberty, that no man shall be taxed but with his own consent. Okay. This is one of the most important themes of this entire historical period, because this is a concept that dates back to that document I mentioned earlier, the Magna Carta. And it centers on the idea that if the government is going to impose taxes on you, it must be done within your consent. And what that means is it's not that they're asking every single individual citizen whether you like it or not, in like a thumbs up or thumbs down situation. It is the representative group or the individual representative for that area has had the ability to fully vet the law, like review it, and then has the ability to make a decision whether they're going to vote on it, in favor of it, or against it. It's no different than if the U.S. Senate meets with its 100 members, 2 from each state, and the 2 people from Indiana have the ability to go through the process of reviewing the law and then finally casting their vote. And regardless of the outcome, they have gone through the process of reviewing the law and voting on it, whether they are in favor of it or against it. Okay. In this case, this law was handed down by the British Parliament 3,000 miles away from the colonies, and it was approved and then implemented in the colonies right away. And colonists are concerned because they've had no way of fully voicing their opinion on it or have had any kind of input on the vote. And the reason why that's significant is because really it comes down to the fact that they don't feel they should have to be able to follow the law because they had no input. There is no representative, one person or a group of people that go to Parliament and vote on behalf specifically on the colonists' behalf. Okay, what you have is a situation where Parliament basically argues that the colonies are represented by way of something called literally virtual representation, meaning that even if there is not a direct representative in the group of Parliament, whether it's the House of Lords or the House of Commons, that's specifically designed to represent the colonies, everybody in that group represents their own district, but the country as a whole. And that's their justification. That's how Britain justifies that this law is perfectly legal. Okay. And so that's going to be coming up time and time again. And so really now you have a debate. Is Britain's statement about this idea of virtual representation actually valid, or do the colonies themselves have a valid argument? The other reason that we have a lot of trouble here is because the colonies naturally over time have developed their own identity. Okay. And if you look here at the second paragraph, it says you were born in Britain, and this author is speaking to the audience, the reader. You were born in Britain, the land of life, and you were raised in America, the land of liberty. So it's very much setting aside, or setting the idea up that America and Britain are 2 very different, places, obviously, but it's almost that America has kind of developed naturally this separate identity. And I think that any colony under any European rule of any kind, whether it's, New Zealand and Australia, whether it was Canada, whether it's, Jamaica, or, whether it's India, all those places, naturally over time are going to develop a separate identity from the country that rules over them. And that naturally allows for the process of independence to happen. Okay? I mean, if you think about all those different time periods, you think about India in 1947, and you think about Australia and New Zealand, those places developed a separate identity from the country that ruled over them that allowed that process to happen. It's no different here, okay? It's interesting here in the second to last paragraph on document A where it says, I urge you to tell your representatives. Well, the representatives they're speaking about are their colonial representatives in the colonial governments, not obviously any representatives in Parliament. Let's look at document 2. Now, this one's interesting. Will Alfred, the author, is actually in London. So this is not someone living in the colonies. And he brings up a very interesting point in this message that he has to the Secretary Conway, who deals directly with the relations of the colonies. And he says that it's not about what's being taxed, it's the method. If you look here, he goes, I was expressing my wonder at this when I was informed that it was not the burden of the tax to be raised, meaning it's not about how much or what's being taxed, but the manner in which it was imposed that created the discontent. So in other words, he's acknowledging the fact that this is a much bigger issue than taxing paper or taxing paper at a certain rate. This is a much bigger issue about representation. Okay? If this is so, the matter is more serious than it may first appear. So it's almost like he's giving a warning to this individual who's a high-ranking official in the British government that you cannot overlook this as just one simple minor rebellion happening in the colonies in which they don't want to pay a tax. This is a much bigger issue, okay? And he goes on to talk about the colonists being our brethren. They're just like us. And we need to kind of think about the fact if we're fully treating them as such. And I think this is kind of an outlier or a unique example because for the most part, I would say British citizens would not consider their brethren to be colonists in America. There is a disconnect. Most natural-born British subjects living in like London, for example, do not consider those living in other colonies to be true Englishmen. Okay, and that's historically been something that's happened for a long time. Okay, let's go to the last one. When the Stamp Act is issued in the fall of 1765, there is not a more dangerous job to take up than the tax collector, because you are the person that is collecting the tax on the stamped paper and then in return giving it to the British government. Okay, and you are the most hated, reviled person in the colonies. You are it. And it's not easy being a tax collector because you are going to be constantly targeted for your allegiance with this law. If you're connected with it, you're taking the job, it's a lucrative position, you're putting yourself in harm's way. Okay, and John Hughes is no example. All right. And so when he talks about, you can see his loyalties here. My lords, he's talking about people in Parliament. He says the colonists have been insulting His Majesty, saying that the Stamp Act was unconstitutional and oppressive. So he's you can tell very clearly where his allegiances, they lie. And he talks about the fact that they're writing defamatory or just like really bad defaming articles in the newspaper that are really criticizing the king. It says right here, no one dares write anything that would calm the people down. Doing so would put the writer's life and fortune in danger. And like, for example, if I wrote something in the newspaper saying, hey, we need to give the law a chance, we're going to benefit from it, I become the targeted person. And so when it says down here, I am daily threatened by verbal messages and anonymous letters, that was the reality. Tax collectors were burned in effigy, which means that a doll or something that was created to appear as a likeness of that person that it was portraying. They could be hanging those from nooses from trees. They could put them on a pole and have people throw rocks at them. There was all different ways that it was done, but it was done to show a demonstration to scare somebody into quitting. Because if you don't have a tax collector, nobody's going to get the tax, okay? So this is very much a reality. And again, this person's a loyalist, securing the allegiance of America to the crown of Britain, destroying the seeds of rebellion. So he sees this happening and punishing the ringleaders of these riots, because there are people that are instigating these riots, many of which are associated with the Sons of Liberty, which is a group we talked about a little bit on Friday. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about these three documents related to these questions that you have for your assignment that's due today? Anybody have any questions about those? All right, I would like to talk about one more thing before we we still have about 15 minutes, but I want to talk. So go back to the course page. And if you would please click on where it says, we're not going to get to the Stamp Act Congress today. We'll have to skip that. Go to where it says Colonial Reaction to Stamp Act, and that's a link that will take you to another document. So go ahead and do that, please. A lot of people, when we talk about this topic year after year, they're pretty astonished the levels in which people went to express their unhappiness with the law. And the reason they're doing this is they're trying to send Britain a message that Britain cannot just create any law they want and expect the colonists to follow it. And so what they're trying to do is to make it to where this stamp tax is so unpopular and is so ineffective that Parliament will essentially repeal it and get rid of it. But what they don't realize is that this is not going to be a one-time situation where they get Parliament to get rid of something and then everything's fine. And things will go back to normal and the colonists will have more freedom and flexibility. That's never going to happen, okay? And so the London Magazine was obviously it portrayed news for England, but it also was portraying a lot of news coming from the colonies. And one thing that you have to be aware of, and this happens all the time even today, is when you are looking at a piece of text, or like in this case, newspaper excerpts, where the newspaper is being written and what it's being written about can oftentimes cause some disconnect, and where you have some situations where news is sensationalized. In other words, you have stories that are fabricated or facts that are kind of twisted, and it happened on both ends. People reading newspapers in London would swear that the colonies were about ready to, destroy England, and people in England, or people in the colonies would be reading things that the king was out to kill, get them all or something like that, and it was sensationalized because they knew people would read it. Okay, and so I want to look at these three excerpts because I think they play a very interesting role in what's going on in the colonies. Okay, so let's look at the first one here, October 1765. This is right around the time that the law is about to go into effect in the colonies. By letters received from Boston and New England, there is an account of a dangerous mob which arose in the middle of August on account of the stamp duty. So when you see the word DUTY, that's just another name for the tax. And did considerable mischief. But on the 16th of August, they were more violent than before, which continued till Sunday the 1st of September, by which time the magistracy, local government, had raised an army, 500 men. Okay, so this is kind of like a militia that they created, and had committed several of the rioters to jail, but not till they had destroyed all the goods and papers of the comptroller, judge of the admiralty, distributor of the stamps, as well as every individual article in the house of the lieutenant governor. So they literally go to this guy's house, the lieutenant governor, second in command of the governor position, and they basically ransack his home. They burn articles of his personal articles. They steal things, and they basically, they're trying to send a message. Okay, burning all his books and papers, carrying off even his clothes, as well as those of his sister and daughter, putting them on by way of masquerade, taking cash, scarce leaving him any more than the shirt he had on. All right, all again to send a message, because if they do this to like a high-ranking official in the government may appeal to Britain to say, like, look, this law is not working. We need to get rid of it. Okay. And then we look at November 1765. The stamp duty is so repugnant to the ideas of the people of America that in most of the northern city colonies, they have obliged the stamp officers to resign their places. In other words, forcing them to resign by intimidation or violence. When the stamped papers arrived at Philadelphia, the vessels in the harbor hoisted their colors half-mast high, the bells rung, being muffled, and every countenance betrayed dejection. Finally, they obliged the stamp distributor to promise not to exercise his office, and the stamp papers were obliged to be taken on board a man-of-war to secure them from the rage of the populace. The lawyers in New Jersey, etc., ampersand and C, etc., have resolved not to use the stamp papers. So if the stamp papers are never distributed, then the tax can never be collected. So it's basically like, again, an intimidation factor to commit to making sure that the paper doesn't get distributed and therefore the tax can be collected, because there are still plenty of loyal subjects in the colonies to Britain, loyal British subjects that are willing to pay the tax and be loyal to their king. Okay. And then we have December. Upon the arrival of the stamps at New York, every sign of mourning appeared. The merchants soon after met and resolved to have no more goods shipped from Great Britain unless the Stamp Act be repealed. This is going to be the most effective form of protest and rebellion during this period, a boycott. Simply refusing to buy British goods, which Britain depends on the colonies to do, sent a huge message because it's a chain reaction. The goods are sent to the colonies refuse to sell them, the goods are returned to Britain, the businessman now has too much product, can't get rid of it, loses money, and over time, he's going to express his concern to his representative in Parliament, and if plenty of people are doing that, it's going to send a message that they're going to have to change tactics here, okay? Repealed means to get rid of. To countermand all orders already sent and not to vend any goods sent from Britain after January 1st next, which means next year. So we're talking about January 1st, 1766. The governor, having secured the stamp paper in Fort George, a great assembly of persons, preceded by lights, went to the fort, took from the stables the governor's coach, which with his effigy they burnt, so like a likeness of him, with every mark of contempt and exasperation under the guns of the fort. After this, they went to the house of Major James, a supposed abettor of the Stamp Act, whose goods they likewise seized and consumed. The next day, they forced from his excellency a declaration that he would have nothing to do with the Stamp Act. So they basically, out of intimidation and fear, got the governor of New York to not support the Stamp Act. These were the methods that were used by people, especially groups like the Sons of Liberty. They were willing to do the dirty work and go to another level to instill fear and violence. And the violence, I would say the craziest they would get was the tarring and feathering. And that did happen. It was not as if it happened in a huge numbers, but pouring hot tar on someone and then covering them in feathers and then parading them around the streets by hoisting them up as a symbol and a message of intimidation was a very powerful tool. And so it's gonna work because the Stamp Act eventually is going to be repealed, but it's not going to be as if Britain's just going to naturally give up. And I think that's one thing that the colonies felt would happen, is that Britain would naturally lose interest in this law and then finally say, okay, we're not going to force that again. But that's not what took place. All right, let's talk about today's exit tickets based on these 3 short excerpts, okay? So you're going to go to the exit ticket on the home page. And what we have here are 2 questions. Question number 1 is, why do you believe the colonists are opposed to the Stamp Act? And then number 2, which I think is a really good question, do you believe that the colonists, their use of violence will do more harm than good? Why or why not? Okay, so in other words, is condoning violence in this setting, in this circumstance, going to be more helpful or more hurtful, in other words, okay? And I think that question too is a good question because it is something we're going to have to talk about is what message is that going to send to other colonists? What message is that going to send to King George III? What message is that going to send to colonial leaders and leaders in Parliament? I think it's a really good question to ask, okay? So tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit about the organized effort made by a group called the Stamp Act Congress to draft a response to this law to Britain and begin to look at some of the various forms of propaganda that was used in the colonies with the various laws. And we're not going to go over every law in tremendous detail, but I think it's something that we could definitely discuss because, you know, a lot of the colonists believed that, you know, they believed that when the Stamp Act was repealed, that would be the end of it. But as we're going to find out, that's not the case. Okay. So make sure to get the exit ticket done and make sure to answer those questions based on those 3 documents, and make sure, please, to get the Stamp Act assignment finished that was from last week. Okay. And so if you have any questions on that, you can let me know. Please make sure, again, that this Friday, is the end of the grading period. There are several of you with missing assignments that are going to have zeros, and I don't want to put zeros in the grade book, but I've done my part to kind of inform you time and time again. Make sure you get those taken care of, and if you have questions, just let me know. So hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.